In just 57 seconds, a courtroom exploded into chaos. A 61-year-old black lawyer, Michelle Obama, stood firm as a powerful judge tried to silence her, sneering that her evidence was worthless. But what happened next stunned everyone. Michelle exposed millions of dollars in secret corruption, racial bias hiding in plain sight, and a judge's own criminal conspiracy. Cameras flashed as police slapped the judge in handcuffs right there in open court. And now, the question that no one can stop asking is this: why would a man who ruled the law for decades risk everything just to destroy Michelle Obama's voice? Judge Clarence Whitaker was a man who believed that a courtroom without entertainment was simply a room full of bored people in suits. He was the kind of judge who thrived on attention, tossing off sardonic remarks like a stand-up comedian working the late-night crowd. His gavel didn't just call for order, it punctuated punchlines. The way he'd lean back in his high-backed chair, fold his arms, and raise one skeptical eyebrow was a performance in itself, earning muffled chuckles from the courtroom gallery and nervous titters from young lawyers trying not to smile. Even his sighs were theatrical, echoing across the chamber like a stage cue, as though the entire judicial system existed purely to test his patience. He'd quip about attorneys drowning the court in paperwork, roll his eyes when witnesses rambled, and sometimes pause dramatically mid-sentence just to let the tension or laughter swell. On more than one occasion, he'd interrupted a heated cross-examination with a dry observation about someone's tie, or muttered under his breath about trials turning into soap operas, which, ironically, made the proceedings feel even more like a soap opera. Reporters loved him because a day in Judge Whitaker's court guaranteed juicy quotes and colorful descriptions for their columns, and their pens scratched eagerly on notepads every time he opened his mouth. The defense team on this particular day sat leaning back in their chairs, smirks playing on their lips, confident that as long as Whitaker presided, the courtroom stage belonged to them. Even jurors occasionally glanced at each other with the faintest hint of amusement, secretly entertained by the judge's cutting sarcasm, though they tried to mask it behind stoic expressions. But beneath the humor lay a sharper edge, a predator's gleam in Whitaker's eye, the certainty that he could crush any lawyer's argument with a single derisive sentence. It was a game he had mastered over years on the bench, a dance of power where every smirk and every scoff served to remind everyone who held the gavel and the rules. To most who entered his court, it was clear. This was not just a place of justice. It was Judge Clarence Whitaker's personal theater, and he relished every minute of the show. But on this day, the audience got a different kind of performance, the kind no one saw coming, the kind that would become the talk of the courthouse for years to come. It started the moment the heavy wooden doors swung open with a soft but commanding thud, and all eyes turned as Michelle Obama entered, a 61-year-old black woman whose very posture seemed to slice through the courtroom's stale air. There was no hesitation in her stride, no flicker of intimidation, as she passed rows of whispering spectators and paused to set her leather briefcase gently on the prosecutor's table. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, the lines crisp and sharp as a blade, her hair pulled back with elegant precision, framing eyes that shone with the kind of unwavering resolve that only comes from decades spent fighting battles in rooms just like this one. Yet, there was something different about Michelle today, a quiet gravity that seemed to ripple outward, catching even the reporters mid-scribble, their pens stalling as they noticed the steely glint in her gaze. It was as though she carried with her an invisible force, a presence so composed it seemed almost regal, but beneath the surface pulsed a fierce determination that dared anyone to challenge her. The defense attorneys who'd been smirking only moments before shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances as if they sensed the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Judge Whitaker's eyes, which had been glittering with the pleasure of his own performance, narrowed as he clocked her arrival. The laughter seemed to drain from the room like air from a punctured balloon, replaced by a tight, buzzing silence, filled with the weight of unspoken questions. Who was this woman who strode into Whitaker's courtroom as though she owned the floor? What secrets did she carry in those neat stacks of folders she carefully arranged on the table before her? And why, despite the judge's imposing presence, did she look utterly unafraid? As she settled into her chair, Michelle glanced briefly toward Judge Whitaker, not with hostility, but with the kind of measured, assessing look a surgeon gives before making an incision. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. She knew she belonged there. She knew why she'd come. And as the echo of the closing doors faded into silence, the entire courtroom leaned forward, compelled by a single question thrumming beneath the hush. What could possibly be so powerful that it might silence even Judge Clarence Whitaker, the man who thought he could control every stage he stood upon? The rustle of papers and the soft murmur of shifting seats set the stage as Judge Clarence Whitaker leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench like an actor about to deliver a carefully rehearsed monologue. His eyes glimmered with a sly amusement as he regarded Michelle Obama across the courtroom, his voice slipping into that familiar tone of sardonic charm. "Miss Obama," he drawled, stretching out her name as if it were a punchline in a private joke. "I assume you've brought more than just your inspiring speeches today?" A ripple of awkward laughter spread through the courtroom, bouncing off the polished wood and high ceilings, though it carried a nervous edge, as though everyone present knew it wasn't entirely safe to laugh too loudly. A few jurors exchanged uneasy glances, while the defense attorneys allowed themselves smirks, emboldened by Whitaker's theatrics. Reporters perked up instantly, pens scratching faster across their notepads, sensing that here was the soundbite they'd been waiting for, the sort of courtroom zinger that would make for delicious headlines. The narrator's voice glides in with wry humor, underlining the absurdity of the scene. It's almost as though Judge Whitaker imagines himself in a comedy club rather than a court of law, the narrator observes, a spotlight shining on him as he tosses jokes instead of judgments, and everyone else is just there to play the audience. Even the bailiff, Officer Jenkins, shifts uncomfortably, unsure if he should laugh along or brace for a brawl. Yet amidst the forced chuckles and shuffling feet, Michelle remains perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her expression as unreadable as polished stone. She doesn't smile. She doesn't blink. And for a moment, the laughter sounds strangely hollow, echoing off marble walls that seem to grow taller and colder with every passing second. Then Michelle speaks, her voice low, but carrying the sharp precision of a blade honed on years of courtroom battles. "Your Honor, I'm here to speak for the taxpayers whose money has vanished," she says, each word delivered with such calm certainty that it slices through the lingering laughter like glass. The sound of chairs creaking punctuates the silence as the audience adjusts, their earlier amusement dissipating into a watchful hush. For the first time that morning, a glimmer of something darker flickers across Whitaker's face, a slight tightening around his eyes, a tension in the set of his jaw. When he replies, his voice has lost its easy humor, replaced by a brittle edge that cuts deeper than any joke. "Taxpayers, or your personal cause?" he asks, the words soft, almost casual, yet coiling with implication like a snake poised to strike. A collective shiver seems to ripple through the courtroom, as though someone has thrown open a window to a bitter wind. The defense attorneys straighten in their chairs, their grins fading into wary neutrality, sensing the sudden, dangerous undercurrent. A woman in the jury box presses her lips together, her brow furrowing as she absorbs the weight behind the judge's question. It's a subtle thing, the way Whitaker tilts his head, the way his gaze lingers a fraction too long, as if daring Michelle to acknowledge the deeper accusation hidden within his words, that her presence, her pursuit of justice, is somehow driven not by law or principle, but by her identity as a black woman. The narrator's voice returns, softer now, tinged with gravity, weaving the tension into a single, ominous thread. And just like that, the narrator intones, the laughter died, because under Whitaker's quips lay poison. Michelle, for her part, doesn't flinch. She holds the judge's gaze, her eyes steady, her voice calm, but the air between them vibrates with the knowledge that the battle has shifted onto terrain far more treacherous than legal arguments alone. The silence that follows feels almost physical, pressing in around the spectators who, moments before, were ready to be entertained. Now they sit riveted, waiting, knowing they've stumbled into a fight that is no longer merely about financial ledgers and legal motions, but about power, race, and who truly belongs in the halls of justice. Michelle Obama sat unmoving for a moment, her expression unreadable as she glanced at the towering stack of files neatly arranged beside her. Then, with deliberate precision, she reached for the first thick binder and flipped it open, the soft thud of paper on wood echoing across the hushed courtroom. One by one, she spread out documents like a magician revealing cards in a trick that no one quite understood yet, each page covered in neat columns of numbers and official seals. Judge Clarence Whitaker watched her with exaggerated horror, his eyebrows climbing so high they nearly disappeared beneath his powdered white wig. With a loud, theatrical sigh, he slumped back in his chair and cast a weary look at the ceiling, as though appealing directly to some higher power for rescue from this impending deluge of paperwork. "Numbers again?" he groaned, stretching the words out, as if he were announcing the world's worst news. "Miss Obama, are you trying to bore us into submission?" The defense attorneys cracked nervous smiles, seizing the judge's cue, while even the reporters, pens still poised, couldn't suppress a few scattered chuckles. The tension from moments before seemed to loosen for a brief instant, the entire room caught in Whitaker's gravitational pull, the way he could pivot from icy menace to comedic showman with alarming speed. The narrator's voice slipped in lightly, brushing humor over the scene like a thin layer of frosting on a cake that might yet hide something bitter inside. "If sarcasm were a sport," the narrator quipped, "Whitaker would be an Olympic champion. Gold medals every time." Officer Jenkins, standing near the side wall, shifted from foot to foot, trying to hide a smirk behind his thick mustache as Michelle continued laying out document after document with a patience that somehow felt both graceful and lethal. Yet behind her calm motions, there was a faint flicker of fire in her eyes, a subtle spark that suggested the laughter would not last much longer. When the courtroom finally fell quiet again, Michelle cleared her throat and stepped slightly to the side, revealing a portable projector now glowing with white light. She clicked a remote, and a document flashed onto the screen, the black and white text crisp and unmistakable even from the back rows. "Here's a document signed by you, Your Honor," she said, her voice cool and unwavering, each word landing like a perfectly aimed stone, dropping into still water. For a fraction of a second, the entire room seemed suspended in silence, as though every person had forgotten to breathe. Then, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery, rolling from the reporters in the back to the jurors in the front, punctuated by the sharp scratch of pens suddenly racing across notepads. Judge Whitaker's face drained of its practiced amusement. The playful glint vanished from his eyes, replaced by something tight and wary, as his gaze darted from Michelle to the glowing screen, then back to the crowd, whose attention now burned into him like spotlights. The document was more than just paper. It was dynamite, and every person in that room could feel the fuse sizzling. For the first time all day, the judge's jaw twitched with a tiny, involuntary tick, and he sat a fraction stiffer in his chair, as though struggling to keep from recoiling physically from the evidence displayed before him. The narrator's voice returned, low and vibrating with the gravity of the moment. A signature worth millions, and the start of Whitaker's fall. Michelle didn't lower her gaze, didn't soften the impact. Instead, she let the silence stretch, the glowing projection throwing stark shadows across the judge's face, revealing not just the lines of age and authority, but a glimmer of fear. The defense team, moments earlier lounging like cats in a sunbeam, now sat bolt upright, eyes wide as they tried to process what this meant for their carefully plotted case. Even Officer Jenkins stood frozen, his fingers resting near the cuffs at his belt, as though some instinct deep inside him was warning that the balance of power in this room had just shifted forever. And in the hush that followed, it became unmistakably clear. The laughter was gone, and the real battle had only just begun. For several beats, the courtroom seemed caught in a strange limbo, the document glowing on the projector screen while the air vibrated with the weight of unspoken words. Judge Clarence Whitaker blinked rapidly, as though trying to erase the sight before him by sheer willpower. Then, with a visible swallow, he leaned forward again, clearing his throat in a way that was meant to project authority, but only betrayed the dryness creeping into his voice. "That's inadmissible," he declared, gripping the edges of the bench as though they might keep him anchored. "I'm the law in this courtroom." His tone was sharp, almost biting, but it cracked ever so slightly on the final word, like glass spidering under pressure. A few jurors blinked in surprise, not so much at his statement as at the sudden desperation behind it, and an uncomfortable murmur rippled through the gallery, unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or hold their breath. Michelle, for her part, simply tilted her head ever so slightly to one side, her expression calm and assessing, like a lioness deciding whether the creature before her was worth the trouble of the kill. "Not anymore, Your Honor," she said softly, each syllable precise as a surgeon's scalpel, slicing through the judge's fragile defense. The words hung in the silence like smoke, and for a second, it seemed Judge Whitaker might leap from his chair, his eyes flashing with indignation and a flicker of pure fear. The narrator's voice glided in with a wry edge, underscoring the electric tension that simmered beneath the surface. If looks could kill, Michelle would have been vaporized on the spot, but she just smiled. It was a smile devoid of arrogance, simply a quiet certainty that the scales had tipped, and for once, it was not the judge who held the upper hand. With the room balanced on the knife edge of Whitaker's fury and the crowd's collective curiosity, Michelle reached into her leather case and pulled out a small, sleek recorder, placing it on the table with a deliberate click that seemed far louder than it should have been. She pressed the play button, and for a brief instant, a low hiss of static filled the chamber, scratching like nails across glass. Then a voice cut through the static, gravelly, familiar, dripping with authority, and unmistakably belonging to Judge Whitaker himself. "Take care of it," the recorded voice snarled. "I don't care how. Make sure she never gets those ledgers." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. The sound of gasps, sharp inhales, and a single stifled cry ricocheted off the marble walls, bouncing back to remind everyone that this was no longer just a legal skirmish. It was an eruption, a devastating breach that tore through the courtroom's polished facade. Whitaker sat frozen, his lips parted as though trying to form words that would not come, while his eyes darted wildly from the recorder to the sea of faces locked upon him in shock and dawning horror. A reporter in the second row dropped his pen, the clatter echoing like a gunshot, and the defense team shrank into their chairs, color draining from their faces as they tried to comprehend the fallout unfolding before them. The narrator's voice returned, quiet yet pulsing with the gravity of finality. And just like that, a man who ruled from a bench was reduced to silence. Even Officer Jenkins, who had spent most of the trial shifting nervously, now stood stiff and alert, one hand drifting toward his belt as though driven by pure instinct. The gentle shuffle of police shoes across the polished floor grew louder as two officers began moving deliberately toward the bench, the glint of metal cuffs catching the overhead lights. The silence in the room thickened, not empty but charged, as though every molecule of air waited to see if Judge Clarence Whitaker would speak, defend himself, or rage against the unraveling of his empire. But he simply sat there, breathing heavily, while the truth played on repeat, echoing across the courtroom he once ruled like a kingdom. For several long seconds, the courtroom remained suspended in an eerie silence, the last echoes of Judge Whitaker's own damning voice still hanging in the charged air. Officer Jenkins, who until that moment had been little more than an anxious shadow at the edge of the room, stepped forward slowly, each footfall sounding louder than a hammer strike on metal. He cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, and adjusted his uniform cap with fingers that seemed to tremble just slightly. Judge Whitaker, sir, you're under arrest," he announced, his voice cracking halfway through the sentence, as if even his vocal cords were reluctant to participate in this unprecedented moment. An awkward silence followed, stretching longer than any silence ought to in a room full of people, suddenly unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or simply stare. The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once, a soft rustle of shifting bodies and whispered disbelief washing through the gallery, like a sudden breeze. The narrator's voice drifted in, tinged with dry humor, weaving lightness into the tension like a thread of silver through dark cloth. "There's no manual for arresting a judge. Jenkins looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Even the jurors, who moments before had been steely-eyed arbiters of justice, now seemed like bewildered spectators in a theater production that had completely gone off script. Michelle, never missing a beat, cocked an eyebrow and leaned slightly toward Officer Jenkins, her voice level and edged with just the faintest trace of irony. "Don't worry, officer. He'll tell you exactly what the law says." A few hesitant chuckles bubbled up from the gallery, despite the tension, a nervous laughter born of sheer disbelief that this was really happening, that the mighty Judge Whitaker was about to be treated like any other defendant in his own courtroom. But the moment of levity was fleeting, vanishing the instant the metallic click of handcuffs broke the hush like the crack of thunder. The sound seemed impossibly loud, reverberating off the paneled walls, as Officer Jenkins gently but firmly twisted Judge Whitaker's wrists behind his back. Whitaker stiffened, his face flushing a deep, mottled red as the cold steel closed around his skin, transforming him in a heartbeat from the towering figure of authority to just another man in chains. His eyes darted wildly around the room, scanning the sea of faces that now stared back at him with a cocktail of shock, fascination, and, worst of all, triumph. His lips parted as though he might protest, but no words emerged, only the ragged sound of his breathing as he sat motionless, his once commanding presence crumbling before the gathered eyes of the court. Then the storm broke. Cameras erupted into a chorus of snapping shutters, flashes exploding like lightning across Whitaker's stricken face as reporters lunged forward, their notepads trembling in their hands. The soft scrape of pen tips turned furious, a frantic symphony of note-taking that threatened to drown out even the clink of the cuffs. The gallery seemed to close in, the tension of months, even years, of whispered suspicions and quiet rumors now detonating into open spectacle. The narrator's voice returned, hushed yet brimming with a certain somber wonder. A man who spent his career deciding people's fates now couldn't even decide if he should stand or sit. Whitaker shifted slightly on the bench, as if trying to rise, then sagged back down, shoulders hunched and eyes unfocused, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Michelle watched him silently, her expression unreadable, though there was a glint in her eyes, a spark that spoke of battles won not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told to sit down, shut up, and stop demanding answers. And as Officer Jenkins gently guided Whitaker to his feet, the judge stumbled, blinking in the relentless glare of the cameras, finally understanding that the courtroom he once ruled was now the scene of his own spectacular fall. As the echoes of the camera shutters faded and the reality of Judge Whitaker's arrest hung heavy over the courtroom like a gathering storm cloud, a new voice suddenly burst into the charged silence. Vincent Morales, the wealthy developer whose empire had seemed so untouchable only hours earlier, lurched up from his chair so abruptly that his suit jacket snagged on the armrest, nearly pulling him off balance. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, the confident gleam that once made him seem invincible, now replaced by sheer, naked panic. His gaze darted from the departing figure of Judge Whitaker, cuffed and shuffling toward the side door, to Michelle Obama, who stood in the center of the courtroom with the quiet authority of a general surveying a battlefield. "Wait," Vincent shouted, his voice cracking so high it echoed off the marble columns. We can work something out." For a moment, the entire room seemed frozen in a collective blink of disbelief, as though they were watching a man claw desperately at the edges of a cliff he'd long pretended wasn't there. The defense attorneys stared at Vincent with thinly veiled horror, as though willing him to sit down before he could drag them deeper into the abyss. A couple of jurors leaned forward instinctively, compelled by the drama, yet unable to look away, their eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and second-hand embarrassment. Even Officer Jenkins, who still hovered near the bench, blinked rapidly as if trying to decide whether he was supposed to intervene or let the spectacle play out. Michelle turned slowly toward Vincent, her movements so measured and precise that it was as if the entire room shifted around her axis. She raised an eyebrow, a tiny gesture that, nevertheless, seemed to drain every last drop of bluster from Vincent's body. "Vincent," she said, her voice low, cool, and tinged with an exasperated patience that might be reserved for a stubborn child. The last person who tried to work something out is getting fingerprinted right now. Her dry humor, delivered with perfect timing, sliced cleanly through the tension, and a ripple of laughter rolled through the gallery despite the chaos. It was a laughter edged with disbelief, the kind of laughter that only bubbles up when people are trying to process something almost too outrageous to be real. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with her hand, eyes shining with shock and a glimmer of delight, as if realizing they were witnessing the final curtain of a drama far bigger than any courtroom show. The reporters, who had been poised for their next headline-worthy moment, exchanged quick glances, some of them already scribbling the quote down, sensing they'd just been handed the perfect closing line for tomorrow's front page. Even Officer Jenkins couldn't quite suppress a tiny grin, tugging at the corner of his lips, though he quickly looked away, conscious of the uniform he wore. For one delicate moment, the entire courtroom seemed to float in a fragile pocket of absurdity, caught between laughter and the undeniable gravity of what was unfolding around them. But the levity evaporated the instant Michelle stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor as she drew closer to the center of the room. The hush that fell was so absolute it seemed to press against the walls, the weight of it palpable as the last echoes of laughter dissolved into tense silence. Michelle paused, gathering every pair of eyes to her, her figure framed by the glow of the projector, still lingering behind her like a halo. She planted her feet, her posture strong and unyielding, and lifted her chin as her gaze swept across the faces of jurors, spectators, and reporters, lingering longest on Vincent Morales, whose hands now trembled against the edge of the table. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of steel, resonating with a power that seemed to fill the cavernous room. "But there's still one question no one has answered," she said, her words clear as crystal, each syllable landing like a drop of water into a pool, sending invisible ripples through every soul present. A faint rustling of fabric echoed as spectators shifted in their seats, the sound amplified in the tense quiet. The court stenographer froze mid-keystroke, her fingers suspended above her machine as though afraid to break the spell. Even the ever-scribbling reporters held their pens motionless, ink waiting for the words that might define the scandal of the decade. Michelle let the silence stretch, holding the entire room in her grasp, her gaze unwavering as she continued. Why would a judge risk his entire life just to silence me? The question, so simple yet so profoundly loaded, seemed to hang in the air like smoke, twisting and curling into every dark corner of the courtroom. Vincent Morales, who only moments ago had been trying to broker some desperate bargain, sagged visibly, his shoulders dropping as though a great weight had settled upon him. His eyes flickered downward, unable to meet Michelle's, as if he feared that whatever truth lay behind that question might burst free and destroy the last shreds of his carefully guarded secrets. Judge Whitaker, now seated between two officers at the side of the room, stared blankly at the floor, his face drained of color, the man who once wielded absolute power, now reduced to a husk of quiet devastation. The spectators held their breath, an unspoken realization dawning collectively that Michelle's fight was not merely a personal crusade, but a battle against a system that had hidden corruption and protected the powerful for far too long. The narrator's voice returned, low and almost reverent, as though speaking over sacred ground. And in that silence, the entire room realized this case was bigger than a single man. It was a battle for the truth itself. Michelle remained standing there, poised and resolute, as though she could feel the unseen tremors moving outward from this single courtroom, shaking foundations far beyond its high wooden doors. She knew there were still forces lurking in the shadows, conspiracies yet untangled, but for this moment, she stood victorious, a quiet warrior who had turned a courtroom into the stage for a truth too powerful to remain hidden. And in the hush that followed, the weight of history seemed to settle on the room, whispering the promise that though one battle had ended, the war for justice was far from over. 1 week later, the courthouse doors swung open as they always did, ushering in the crisp morning air and the low murmur of people filing in for another day of hearings, motions, and testimony. The scandal that had detonated inside its walls still hung over the building like a charged storm cloud. Reporters clustered outside, eager for scraps of new information, while rumors swirled through the hallways about who might be implicated next. Yet, in the middle of all this tension, Michelle Obama strode back into the courthouse as though the earth hadn't shifted beneath its marble floors just days earlier. Her steps were steady, her eyes bright, and though there were dark circles of fatigue beneath them, there was also a glimmer of something else, a quiet triumph that refused to be hidden. She wore the same sharply tailored black suit, the same glint of determination in her gaze, but there was a subtle difference now, as though the weight of an invisible burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The bailiff, Officer Jenkins, greeted her at the security checkpoint with an awkward half-smile, still clearly wrestling with the memory of having arrested a sitting judge in front of a full courtroom. Michelle paused, leaned closer, and lowered her voice in a conspiratorial whisper. "No recordings today, unless you want a new judge in handcuffs," she said, her lips twitching with just the faintest hint of mischief. Jenkins's eyes went wide, his mouth dropping open for a split second before he let out a startled laugh, one hand flying up to cover his face as though he'd been caught laughing in church. A ripple of gentle chuckles spread through the small crowd waiting in line behind her, a moment of lightness blooming amid the lingering tension of a courthouse still reeling from scandal. Even one of the clerks peered over her stack of paperwork and grinned, as though grateful for a brief reprieve from the weight of the past week's revelations. And in that fleeting moment, it was as if the entire building exhaled, the walls themselves seeming to relax, reminded that even in the aftermath of chaos, humor could still spark like a tiny flame in the dark. Michelle offered Officer Jenkins a wink, then straightened her posture and continued on her way, leaving a trail of quiet smiles in her wake. But beneath the laughter, the echoes of what had transpired still lingered like an aftershock, vibrating through every corridor and courtroom. Judge Clarence Whitaker's once commanding presence had vanished, replaced by whispered questions and hurried conversations behind closed doors. Files were being reviewed, investigations reopened, and the web of connections that had seemed so invincible was now fraying under the scrutiny of daylight. People who had once felt untouchable now found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering if the next piece of evidence would bear their name. Yet amid this turmoil, one truth shone clear, cutting through the confusion and fear like a shaft of sunlight piercing storm clouds. The narrator's voice softened, carrying a gentle authority tinged with reverence. Michelle Obama taught us that power can be terrifying, but it's never unstoppable. One voice can bring down corruption, racism, and arrogance. No matter how high someone sits, they're never above the truth. The camera of the mind's eye pans out slowly, revealing Michelle stepping out of the courthouse doors, the sunlight catching her profile, casting her in a warm, resolute glow. Her posture remains strong and steady, shoulders squared against the world, as if carrying not just her own victories, but the hope of countless others who had watched her stand unflinching in the face of a system determined to silence her. Spectators and journalists watched her go, a hush falling over them as they realized they were witnessing more than just a legal triumph. They were witnessing a lesson written in courage and sacrifice. In the stillness, the murmured conversations faded, replaced by an unspoken agreement among those who remained. That the measure of justice is not found in marble walls or heavy gavels, but in the courage of individuals willing to speak the truth, no matter the cost. And as Michelle disappeared into the crowd outside, leaving the courthouse behind, the story remained alive in every whispered retelling, carrying a promise that though corruption might hide in shadows, there would always be someone willing to drag it into the light. The character of Michelle Obama, as depicted in this story, is entirely fictional and does not represent the real Michelle Obama or any real person in real life. All names, characters, and incidents portrayed in this story are products of the author's imagination and are used fictitiously for dramatic storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful tales of courage, justice, and truth, Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Your support helps me keep creating stories that inspire and captivate. Thank you for watching.